When you hear the words the Dark Ages, you may picture a world shrouded in fog, a crumbling Roman Empire, castles under siege, peasants living in filth. Disease, superstition, silence, 1,000 years of ignorance. That's the image most of us were given. But what if that picture is wrong? What if the story we were told left out all the quiet light that still burned? As you begin to rest now, let your mind drift to a different view of those centuries. Not one of darkness, but of survival, of learning, of beauty found in unexpected places. This is the real story of the Dark Ages, a story that might just help you sleep, not from boredom, but from peace. The term Dark Ages was invented much later. Renaissance thinkers looked back at the time before them and saw little they respected. They saw themselves as the rediscoverers of wisdom, believing that everything between the fall of Rome and their own era was a wasteland. But this wasn't true. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD did lead to turmoil. Roads broke down, trade collapsed, and cities shrank. But people didn't vanish. Knowledge didn't die. It moved. In quiet monasteries scattered across Ireland, England, and Gaul, monks sat in candlelit rooms with ink-stained hands, carefully copying ancient texts. They didn't always understand every word, but they preserved them. Homer, Plato, Aristotle. Sacred writings. Medical knowledge, laws. Everything they could save, they did. Because they believed in the future. Because they believed someone, someday, would read those words again. And while the West was finding its footing, the East was thriving. In Constantinople, the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire stood strong. It protected libraries, maintained Romang law, and built grand churches like the Hagia Sophia. This was not a world in collapse. It was a world in transition. While one system crumbled, another evolved. Let's go even further. South of Europe, in the Islamic world, a golden age was beginning. Cities like Baghdad, Damascus, and Cordoba became centers of learning. Scholars translated Greek and Persian texts into Arabic. They discovered new ideas in astronomy, medicine, mathematics, and philosophy. They didn't just protect knowledge, they expanded it. Algebra, algorithms, and even the names of many stars we know today came from this time. Europe would eventually rediscover this treasure, but for centuries it thrived elsewhere. Back in the so-called darkened lands of Europe, something else remarkable was happening. Farmers began using new tools like the heavy plow and the horse collar. These innovations allowed more land to be cultivated. Crop rotation began to appear. Grain mills powered by rivers were introduced. It wasn't flashy progress, but it was real. The population grew slowly. Villages took root. Life moved on. Let's not forget the art. Yes, the grand sculptures of ancient Rome were gone. But something new was growing. In manuscript margins, monks painted tiny illustrations in gold and blue. In villages, people wove patterned fabrics. On church walls, frescoes bloomed in color. Music took shape in plainsong and chant, filling the stone walls of churches with harmony. The beauty wasn't missing. It had just changed form. Even the idea that no one could read or write is a myth. Literacy rates were lower, yes, but people were learning. Cathedral schools taught boys Latin and logic. Kings and queens wrote letters and laws. Charlemagne, the king of the Franks, launched what we now call the Carolingian Renaissance, a brief, bright era where learning flourished. He invited scholars to his court. He built schools. He supported copying ancient texts. Europe was not asleep. It was rebuilding. Meanwhile, languages were shifting. Latin, once the language of empire, began to evolve into French, Spanish, Italian, and others. It wasn't the end of communication. It was the birth of new voices. Each region found its own sound, its own rhythm. its own way to speak of the world. In this quiet transformation, a new Europe was forming. As your breathing slows, imagine a monk in a stone chamber, gently dipping his pen in ink. He sits on a stool, backbent, copying line after line of a Roman text he may never fully understand. He is tired. His hands ache, but he keeps writing, because something in him believes the words matter. Or picture a farmer teaching his son how to use a new kind of plow. The soil is hard, the work is endless, but it's more productive than before. There is food on the table. That is progress, even if it's not remembered. This was the heartbeat of the Dark Ages, not war or ignorance, but small acts of preservation and innovation. Lives lived with courage and care. The survival of stories, of science, of spirit. They didn't shout, but they endured. And that's what kept civilization alive. In the silence of night, when armies weren't marching and thrones weren't changing, people were simply living. Sewing, cooking, planting. Singing. They laughed. They prayed. They told stories. The world didn't go dark. It just grew quieter. And sometimes, in the quiet, something beautiful can grow. Let your body rest now. Let your thoughts slow. Let this image fill your mind, not of 1,000 years lost, but of 1,000 years held together by human hands. Hands that wrote, built, learned, dreamed. The Dark Ages weren't empty. They were full of flickering lights scattered across time and place, waiting to be seen again. As the centuries passed, the world continued to turn quiet. Life myth of a dark, hopeless era slowly dissolved when seen through gentler eyes. The people who lived during this time were not waiting for the Renaissance to rescue them. They were surviving. They were adapting. And they were building the foundations for a world that would one day rise again. History, like life, is not a single light switch flipped on or off. It is a candle passed from hand to hand. Sometimes the flame is small. Sometimes it flickers. But it keeps burning. And in the Dark Ages, that candle never went out. In villages far from the reach of kings, people passed down stories not in grand books, but in songs and poems, in carvings on wood and symbols stitched into cloth. These weren't empty years. They were years of quiet culture. Stories of saints and dragons, of miracles and monsters, kept spirits alive. These tales were passed from mother to child, from fireside to field, forming a hidden thread of continuity. And while we often focus on the fall of cities, it was in the countryside where most life was lived, where most memories were made. Women held communities together in these times, often unnoticed by chroniclers. They baked, wove, healed, and taught. Midwives delivered life while kings debated death. Wise women used herbs passed down through generations. Their knowledge, unrecorded in scrolls, was just as vital as any royal decree. It was they who remembered, who kept small truths alive when the world seemed to forget everything else. And education, while not universal, was not extinct. In monastic schools, boys learned to read, to count, to reason. They memorized psalms. They practiced script. They studied the stars. It wasn't a golden age of knowledge, but it was not an age without it either. Slowly, carefully, the seeds of thought were planted. They waited underground for the right time to rise. Trade routes, though fewer, still existed. Along dusty roads, merchants carried salt, cloth, spices, and news. Pilgrims walked for weeks to reach sacred sites. They talked to strangers. They brought back stories. Even in hardship, people moved. They reached out. They shared. No era in which people help one another can truly be called dark. Let's travel now. Slowly to the far north. To Iceland. To monasteries where stories of gods and heroes were written down in sagas. They weren't writing for fame. They were writing so stories wouldn't die. The Vikings, often painted as destroyers, were also explorers, traders, and storytellers. They connected distant lands. They helped shape what Europe would become. And then we returned to the heart of Europe. As time passed, cities began to grow again. Cathedrals rose slowly, stone by stone. Their pointed arches and stained glass were not sudden miracles. They were the result of centuries of learning how to build upward, how to paint with light. The Gothic world didn't appear from nowhere. It grew out of roots sunk deep in these so-called dark years. Even language tells the story. Latin slowly fractured into new voices: French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian. This wasn't a collapse. It was an evolution. Each new dialect carried history within it. The words changed, but the people kept speaking. And in their speech, they carried the past. By the 11th century, Europe had begun to change shape. Feudal systems formed. Castles rose. Universities were just beginning. And yet, all of it was built on the efforts of those who lived in quieter times. Without their quiet copying, their patient building, their faith and their fire, there would be no foundation to rise from. Now, take a breath. Imagine yourself in one of those candlelit scriptoriums. The air smells of wax and parchment. You hear the faint scratch of a quill against parchment. Outside, wind brushes through trees. A monk pauses, rubs his eyes, then keeps writing. He doesn't know your name. He never will. But the book he copies may one day shape your thoughts. This is legacy not through fame, but through care. Let's go outside that monastery. There, a carpenter teaches his son how to bend wood for a wheel. A mother sings to her child while weaving a basket. A shepherd watches the stars and begins to give them names of his own. These moments don't fill history books, but they are history. They are the true thread between centuries. The Dark Ages weren't a pause in progress. They were a time when progress slowed, hid, and waited. They remind us that not all change is loud. Some is slow. Some is quiet. Some is born not from conquest or invention, but from endurance, from the simple choice to keep going. As your breathing deepens now and your body grows still, remember this: history does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers. It whispers in the scratch of a pen, in the hush of a winter night, in the steps of a child learning to walk across a stone floor. The past is not just war and power. It's also warmth. Kindness, stillness, and survival. So when you next hear someone speak of the Dark Ages, think instead of the light within. The books that were saved, the songs that were sung, the bread that was baked, the children who learned, the hearts that hoped. These were not dark years. They were deep years. Years of roots growing quietly underground. And when the time was right, those roots would become trees. Tall, strong, ready to carry the world forward again. Rest now. Let go of old myths. Let truth cradle you. And know that even in history's darkest hours, there was always a little light, and that light was never lost, only waiting.